Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the first of our main conference. Today we have the pleasure to have Anthony Vidler as our keynote speaker. He's one of those actors of the architectural theories scene who does not need any presentation. But according to the protocolary standards, I should just mention a few of his outstanding achievements. Dean of the Irwin S. Channing School of Architecture at the Cooper Union, New York, from 2001 to 2013. He had previously taught at Princeton for almost 3 decades, serving as the William Grant Cannon Jr. Chair of Architecture, the chair of the PhD committee, being also the director of the program in European Cultural Studies. He has been awarded by the Guggenheim Foundation, the National Endowment for the Humanities, and the Society of Architectural Historians. He was a Getty Scholar at the Getty Center for the History of Art and the Humanities in 1992-93, and a Senior Mellon Fellow at the Canadian Centre of Architecture in 2005. Amid an intense writing activity that has brought to life more than 200 articles and at least 7 seminal books, he has also found some time to design and curate the most influential exhibitions on both Ledoux and Sterling. But above all this biographical information, I would like to underline the reasons why we definitely wanted him to come. Probably most of you have read his Histories of the Immediate Present, written in 2008 and recently translated into Spanish. An extremely courageous exercise to transform the genre of the historiographical revision into a personal and demanding analysis of modernity's contradictory relations with history. From the very first pages of the book, the idea of autonomy is addressed in a twofold perspective. On the one hand, formal autonomy, as architecture's self-consciousness of its internal and structural reasons, usually devoid of any political commitment to its social context and expressed mainly in aesthetic terms. On the other hand, disciplinary autonomy, as architecture's development of specific procedures to deal with reality compared to other fields, whether artistic or scientific, being therefore a result of historical time. But his scholarship on the concept of autonomy began long before this book. In 2001, he published an article on Kaufmann's claims for Kantian autonomy in Perspective number 33, a volume that curiously also contains the polemical notes around the Doppler effect by Robert Somol and Sarah Whiting, who will be also our guest on Wednesday. We could even trace his interest on the topic back to 1996, when a conference honoring Philip Johnson's career entitled Autonomy and Ideology took place in New York, supported by the MoMA, the CCA, and Columbia University. Vidler ends his Perspective article with a comment on this event, where the way in which the European avant-garde was assumed in the American context was discussed. The inflation that architectural theory experimented at the United States until the 90s has been the key for the redefinition of many European ideas that we are still around from this side of the globe. The role Anthony Vidler took in this crossed exchange is also another reason why we have invited him. He was trained as an architect at Cambridge and obtained his doctorate at Delft, 2 of the most prestigious educational institutions in Europe. But from the first time you talk to him, you realize he's the kind of person that, answering to a call of a friend, Peter Eisenman in this case, moves from one continent to another, and what was supposed to last a year ends up as a lifetime trip. Tony, we are so grateful you accepted our invitation. We sincerely appreciate the effort you have done for being here with us today, and we are sure everyone in this room will benefit from your sharp and brilliant insights on what can still be said today about architectural autonomy. Please join me and give a warm welcome to Mr. Vidler.
Thank you, Sylvia, so much. I guess just to add to a little bit of genealogy, so that in America we now have to have full transparency and full admittance of where one comes from and what one is and where one speaks from. So I have to say that yes, I'm complicit in this notion of autonomy from the very beginning of my career, when I went to Cambridge and was presented with my tutor at Cambridge, Colin Rowe, with whom I sat for about 3 hours, sometimes 5 if the martinis lasted that long, once a week for 2 years. That was Rowe. The first time I met Peter Eisenman was in my first term as a student in the studio at Cambridge, where Peter Eisenman transformed from a PhD student into a teaching instructor, a lecturer, and was my first studio instructor in design. So between Rowe and Eisenman, these two monsters, like some Charybdis and Scylla at the mouth of the Mediterranean, I have survived. So today is a kind of retrospective journey, and it caused me, when I realized the subject of this conference, to reflect on this lifetime, which fortunately I have enough distance. The British had this ability to distance themselves from themselves, like a kind of personal Brexit. They can distance, so I can see myself as somebody else. And so as somebody else, I retraced the autonomy debates and the relationship between architecture and society in a slightly different way than I've done it before, because I now believe in the context of the emerging catastrophe, which is our world, can I say order or world disorder? The emerging catastrophe of our world disorder. I believe that the question of architecture and its autonomy, if it has any, is of increasing urgency. Architecture conceived, that is, as habitat, and millions, if not billions, of populations now needing very direly both habitat and environment in a world that is gradually depriving them of both habitat and environment to the benefit of a very, very small percentage of highly remunerated corporations and capitalist individuals. So when I think of the word autonomy, I also think of the word discipline, because somehow the relations of architecture to itself and the relationships of architecture to the world are, in fact, disciplinary relations. When I think of the word autonomy, first and foremost, I think of this specificity of craftsmanship, or techne, which Plato, first in the Republic and then in the Laws, ascribed to each individual who had techne in the society of the polis, whether it was the humble craftsman shoemaker or whether it was the statesman or politicus. Each had his own, and it was his own at that moment in time. Each had his own particular discipline. Each had his own particular techne, and that was the role of that individual in that society. The closed and tightly controlled and isolated utopic societies of Plato's polis, moving through history to the world as figured here by Buckminster Fuller in the 50s, the post-war world, which is the emerging globalized world, and here from Getty Images, an image of the world in total connectivity and total interrelatedness through networks of different kinds. This is the world in which architecture then has to stand in relationship to any possible autonomy it can claim. But the autonomy that it claims comes from the first individual to claim that architecture is a discipline, The discipline, after all, was first used, disciplinis, by Vitruvius in the 1st century AD, and he, in the last century BC. And you can see here that all the questions that have in some way beset the quote-unquote theory of architecture, and I do have to say that since meeting for the first time Peter Smithson a long time ago in the Architectural Association and giving a lecture which he very kindly sat through, and then came up to me and very brusquely, like Peter Smithson did, and said, yeah, you're quite bright, aren't you? Talking about theory. Quite frankly, theory terrifies me. And I said, but my dear Peter Smithson, theory is just a way of thinking about architecture. So basically, I cut the word theory from my vocabulary, and now I just talk about thinking about architecture. And that doesn't frighten students nearly as much, because after all, when you start to draw, when you start to work with different kinds of programs, you have to think. And to think about architecture is what we do when we design. So Vitruvius gives us two definitions, polarized definitions, or definitions that he tries to bring together in what he calls the corpus, or the body of architecture, with the human body as an analogy. Architecture is the science, the knowledge, or the skill of many, many disciplines and various kinds of erudition. The architect has to know, he has to be literate. The architect has to be literate so that the architect can write, the architect can speak, and the architect can read. The architect has to be able to draw, the architect has to know geometry, the architect has to know history, because otherwise the works that the architect draws on can't be authorized. The architect has to know philosophy, otherwise the architect can't think. The architect has to know music, otherwise the architect has no idea of proportions. The architect has to know medicine, otherwise the architect doesn't know anything about climates. The architect has to know law, otherwise the architect is going to be sued. The architect has to know astrology, because otherwise the architect doesn't know anything about space. The architect has to know optics and climates and so on. But having knowledge of all those doesn't mean that that makes the architect. The architect is concerned with order, ordinatio, arrangement, dispositio, eurythmy, or rhythm, symmetry, symmetria, proprietary or decorum, that is appropriateness to the place and the institution, distribution, that is the organization of the plan and the section, and economy, which is the organization of that in relationship to the means at hand. So all these words, of course, became part of the theory of architecture when Vitruvius was discovered in the 1450s by Poggio Bracciolini and passed on to Alberti, who used it to rewrite the treatise in his architectural treatises, and then the published in the Renaissance for the first time by Barbaro with Palladio's illustrations, and then translated again in the academies of Europe, in the French Academy in 1670 by the doctor Claude Perrault, who fortunately for his patients was pulled from his medical practice into the Academy of Architecture in order to translate Vitruvius. We have some very, very lurid descriptions of how Perrault's cures actually killed his patients, but he was sort of safer in architecture and with the east facade of the Louvre, as you remember. But this corpus of knowledge, which we call Vitruvius, was continually rehabilitated, reframed, reorganized, all the way through to modernism, which had a hard time itself ridding itself of these particular framing devices of architecture. And it was the Enlightenment, and specifically the French Enlightenment and Kant, who had a tremendous effect on the way in which modernity and modernism in particular were able to sweep away the Vitruvian structure of thought and to construct what we just heard was the notion of rationalism. The rationalism which allowed us to clear away myths, clear away ideologies, and to understand things from the ground up from the root up, and nothing more nor less than Immanuel Kant's critique of pure reason, and his answer to what is enlightenment. Do we now have an enlightened age? No, we don't have an enlightened age, but we live in an age of enlightenment. In other words, enlightenment is present in that age. And here you see the preface to the first great encyclopedia of Diderot and d'Alembert in the 1750s, that extraordinary frontispiece where truth, who as a figure symbolically was veiled throughout the Middle Ages, was now going to become illuminated in the temple of reason with all the muses of the sciences and the arts clustered around to give her the truth. And it was in the immediate pre-war World War II period that someone like Ernst Cassirer, the philosopher, took on the cause of the Enlightenment, tried to bring Rousseau and Kant together as enlighteners, and published his first great synchronic thesis of the Enlightenment, the philosophy of the Enlightenment, in 1932. 1932, which was a very difficult and dangerous moment in Germany and in Austria, as we shall see, to publish a work which was fundamentally based on the critique of pure reason, which by the 1920s had become the watchword of democratic socialism. And this is where I do have to disagree with those who feel that Emil Kaufmann was bringing Ledoux and Le Corbusier together in his work, Von Ledoux bis Le Corbusier of 1933, and again when in an exile in America in the 1950s, he was bringing Ledoux and Le Corbusier in Vienna in 1933 together under the idea of architectural autonomy, precisely in parallel to the idea of Kantian autonomy. The Kantian autonomy idea, of course, was that which gave the individual rights to choice, to select, to freedom, and to destiny. And the bringing of architecture into the Kantian argument was precisely a political gambit, disguised under the heading of art history, but it was not very long before Kaufmann himself was forced to flee from a Vienna which was entirely occupied by the troops from Germany and under Hitler's National Socialism. So Von Ledoux bis Le Corbusier, which proposes a vision of architecture which geometrically reduced and clear in its symbolization for modern times, the house of the charcoal burner on the top, the house of the shepherds that curate the environment in the middle, and the house of justice and community that cubically symbols correctness, solidity, and justice on the bottom. These three political emblems of architecture, advanced by Ledoux in relationship to his reading of Rousseau, is advanced by Kaufmann in relationship to his reading of Kant and in relationship to his commitment as a Jew who could never himself gain a university post in Austria, had to work as a bank clerk after his PhD in architecture, something I guess many PhDs in architecture nowadays will be facing. He had to work as a bank clerk before he went into exile into the United States. So this is a political statement. He has Montesquieu and Kant cited on the frontispiece of his work. And here you can see a quotation from the end of that work. At the moment when, with the Declaration of the Rights of Man, the rights of the individual are affirmed, at the moment when, in place of the old... Hello? I'm a bit busy at the moment. Could you just hang up and I'll call you back? Thank you. At the moment when, with the Declaration of the Rights of Man, the rights of the individual are affirmed, at the moment when, in place of the old moral heteronomy, Kant institutes the ethics of autonomy, Ledoux establishes the foundations of autonomous architecture. It's a purely political formal statement. It's a statement which brings the formal right in front of the politics. And he's looking at the ideal city of Ledoux, consecrated to the principles of the Republic of Rousseau, and he's comparing it to the ideal city of Le Corbusier in Geneva, the Cité Mondiale, organized by Otley from the offices of the World Order of Workers in Brussels, and proposing an ideal city to construct knowledge above Lake Geneva in relationship to the competition for the League of Nations. Corbusier, of course, had this notion that had he won the League of Nations, he could then construct the knowledge of the world for a perpetual peace, as Kant himself had spoken of. It was, paradoxically enough, that a particular formal spokesperson for architectural autonomy that read Kaufmann's book in the German, Philip Johnson, who had earlier espoused slightly proto-fascist principles and had in fact entered as a young journalist Poland with the German invading armies on behalf of the fascist newspaper in America. It was Philip Johnson who actually paid for Emil Kaufmann to come to the United States, saved him from Europe, gave him a position in the Society of Architectural Historians, gave him one of his first lectures in America, and in this brief series of illustrations illustrating the formal principles of his glass house built in New Canaan in 1949 includes Emil Kaufmann's illustration of Ledoux from Ledoux bis Le Corbusier on the bottom left of this slide. So there we have somebody abstracted from the politics of Europe, certainly very hastily abstracting him from any kind of fascist sympathies. Philip Johnson, after the war, claiming a formal autonomy of architecture based on what he sees as the simple formal autonomy of Schinkel, of Mies, and of Ledoux. Those formal autonomies consistently repeated over and over again in the United States without much relationship to the social autonomy, the neo-Kantian autonomy constructed by Kaufmann. Vickover, also an exile, now in London, took the same route of understanding form as a kind of modernist diagram of space in his analysis of Palladio in 1946, a route which was, of course, picked up by my tutor Colin Rowe, who incessantly compared Palladio's villa to Le Corbusier's villas. And you can see on the left in that first article, the mathematics of the ideal villa, an article he published in 1947, just before, 2 years before Vickover himself published his own study of Palladio. This is a warning to any of you who may be PhD students. Do not publish your advisor's findings before your advisor does. Your advisor won't really be very happy. And Vickover certainly was not very happy with Rowe, because Rowe didn't even include a footnote to Vickover in this article. So if you do publish your advisor's findings before she does, put a footnote in, because that will at least give you scholarly credibility. So these are the three gentlemen gathered, who were the, if you like, the inspiration of my book, The Histories of the Immediate Present. Raina Banham in uncharacteristic formal dress on the right. Nicholas Pevsner, chain smoking in the middle. And John Summerson, that suave Englishman with a glass of sherry on the right. So you have Banham, Pevsner, and Summerson. Now, this began a very powerful debate in England, which was very quickly picked up in Italy, as we shall see, in the late 1950s and early 1960s. This was at a lecture that Pevsner gave in 1961 at the Royal Institute of British Architects, where he was complaining that architects in Britain at the time, in the 1950s, were beginning to imitate modernist architecture from the 20s. And he said he was a great fan of Gropius, and of course he was someone who entirely disliked this sense of historical imitation, and he blamed himself for having written a history of the modern movement, and thus historicized something which should never be historicized, which should also always be in the process of reinvention. And so in the center of that group, Pevsner was seriously self-apologizing for actually historicizing the modern movement. Summerson was less worried. He had published an article and given a lecture too at the Royal Institute of British Architects in 1957 called The Case for a Theory of Modern Architecture, where he came to the conclusion that the best hope for modern architecture's theory was not form, was not technology, certainly was not history, but was the program, was in fact the brief that the architect could develop with the client in order to develop the functionalist thrust of modernism. Well, Banham was disagreeing with Summerson in 1960-61, where he published his own doctoral thesis, having written it under the aegis of Nicholas Pevsner, trying to finish Pevsner's work. Pevsner stopped at 1914-15. Banham starts around 1909 and ends in the 1930s. But his is not a pure history of architecture. It's what Tafuri will later call an operative, of theory. It is actually a polemical history. It's a history which questions the allegiance of modernism to the first industrial age. On the left, in a very important final juxtaposition of illustrations, on the left he gives you that icon of modernism, Corbusier's villa at Poissy, and on the right, something that architects had preferred to ignore, the Buckminster Fuller Dymaxion house of exactly the same year. And Banham asked the question at the end of Theories and Design, asked the question, well, which is the most modern, which is the most contemporary, which is the most attendant to the technologies of the age. And Banham then, as opposed to program, then advances the idea of technology as the salvation of a contemporary architecture. And you can see here with François Dalagre, him seated on the right with Dalagre on the left, naked in this totally hermetically sealed bubble of a house which is not a home, or a home that is not a house, with all the technology needed sitting in the center. Dalagre actually told me quite recently that Banham actually had refused to be photographed nude for this particular collage, and so Dalagre actually used his own reverse nude figure and collaged Banham's head on the top of it in order to give Banham that house is not a future. So we have Summerson program, Banham technology, And hey presto, 3 years later, our friend Peter Eisenman with form, the idea of form in modern architecture. His thesis, which he put into Cambridge syndicates in 1963, and which became the basis of his continual self-referential understanding of architecture as form, architecture as a formal discipline that relied on the internal structures of form itself. Excuse me. So we have architecture at this point in 1963. Was there water in there? No, there was no water in there. Was there water? Okay. Awfully sorry. So we have architecture divided into 3. Is that not Vitruvius? Firmitas, Venustas, and Commoditas. We have the Commoditas as program, the Firmitas as technology, and the Venustas as form. So architecture in the mid-60s was totally split in terms of these 3 waves. And you see that people like Stirling go the historicist formal way, people like Smithson go the functionalist way, and people like Foster and Rogers go the high-tech, technological way. And you can't bring them together except at dinner parties, but certainly not in theory conferences. Something broke. There we have Eisenman saying, well, house is not a home, but it's certainly not the Banham bubble. It's actually formal slash, and if you can get a bed in, you're lucky. So it's at this point that a young professor at Princeton, who's working with Harlem community groups as a committed left Marxist sort of social democrat on the left, myself, decide to work to try to close the gap around questions not of the autonomy of architecture, but of the typology of architecture. And it's about the typology of architecture that I want to speak. I wrote this little essay in 1976. It's the 3rd typology. It's probably the most republished essay of any that I have ever written. It's probably the worst essay that I've ever written. It was written between midnight and 3 o'clock in the morning when Peter Eisenman called me saying that he needed an editorial for the next issue of Oppositions and it had to be tomorrow. So I don't know what it was. It was probably the bottle of Bordeaux, or maybe it was a good, half glass of good scotch. I don't know what it was, but the 3rd typology emerged by morning and was sent to Oppositions and was published, and then I read it once after I published it with horror and hadn't read it again until I had prepared this lecture. So it has some merit, but very little merit. Its problem is it's far too quick, far too caricatural, far too clumsy, and far too didactic, and it has the ring of a manifesto when it wasn't meant to be a manifesto. I wanted simply to trace the problem of typology from the early Enlightenment, when the typology of architecture retreated and went all the way back to the notion of the first hut, the first elements of shelter, moved into the machine age as a kind of a technological instrument of social and environmental power under Bentham, and then had evolved, and of course in between 65 and 75, the most important work to emerge in the Euro-American context was L'architettura della città of Aldo Rossi, published in '65 in several translations and iterations across Europe afterwards, culminating in the big collage, La città analoga, in 1976, was the inspiration of my sense that typology, if abstracted in the right way, if formulated in the right way, could in fact construct an equal and balanced relationship between socio-political questions and architectural questions in one. What persuaded me of this was an article by Giulio Carlo Argan in the 60s that had started the typological debate in Italy. It was an article by Argan on the concept of typology in architecture, and Argan used for the basis of his argument an essay that went all the way back to the late Enlightenment. It went all the way back to Quatremère de Quincy, a thinker and an encyclopedist and a Beaux-Arts theorist of the early 19th century. The fact, said Carlo Argan, that certain architectural typologies have been formulated, they exist, and have been passed down from treatises and architectural practice cannot be denied. Typologies exist, and therefore it is legitimate to pose the problem of typology, whether in the historical process of architecture or the conceptual and operative procedures of individual architects, i.e. he was proposing the notion of typology as something which could help and develop design. And it was Quatremère de Quincy's idea of typology that he picked up on, and it was Quatremère de Quincy that said the notion of type, and here Quatremère de Quincy is reaching all the way back to Plato and Platonic forms, the notion of type proposes less the image of a thing to copy. Type is not a copy. Type is not a template. Type is not something that imitates. Type is an idea. The idea of type. Type is an idea in architecture. It's a fragment, a sketch, the thought of an architect, a more or less vague description that gives rise in the imagination of an artist to a work. One will say that the type has provided the architect with such and such idea, such and such motif, or such and such interpretation. Thus, the type is something that floats, if you like, above the material reality of a thing. You don't copy the thing, you begin to interpret the idea of the thing and develop that. And this was the notion that was extremely important for a group of architects, teachers, and theorists in Rome and in Venice that took on the notion of typological theory in the 60s and 70s. And it was Saverio Muratori who, teaching the theory of composition at the University of Venice, instituted a study of the Venetian fabric. Oh, sorry. Okay, thank you. Who developed a theory of typology in relationship to Venetian vernacular, much helped by the first and great woman professor of architecture and urbanism at the University of Venice, Renata Trincanato, who herself developed an extraordinary typological study of Venetian vernacular, that extraordinary book called Venezia Minore, but picked up by Muratori as a definition of the way in which architecture should work consistently to reinvent its typologies, taking over the history of composition and the theory of composition at the University of Venice. For Muratori, when he went back to Rome, was, of course, Carlo Aimanino, who brought with him to Venice Aldo Rossi. This is Aldo Rossi standing tall next to the columns of the Parthenon. That's how architects like to picture themselves. And it was Aldo Rossi, of course, in the pages of Casabella as a young assistant to Ernesto Rogers in the 1950s, who had picked on Emil Kaufmann, did a very, very fine series of reviews of Kaufmann's architecture of the Enlightenment, and who was inspired literally to translate from the French the manuscript of Etienne Louis Boulet, the late 18th century Enlightenment architect, whose visions of a library and of a sarcophagus are reprinted there in Aldo Rossi's CRITICALL sull'architettura e la città. And so we find that Aldo Rossi is coming out of Kaufmann and out of Argan and out of Muratori as he moves into his collected essays, which he bundles under the title of L'Architettura della Città, going all the way back to the rationalism of the Enlightenment, of Milizia on the top right, in order to construct models or modelli of typologies for the present. It was that particular vision of a city constructed. He was, as you will remember, very, very strongly influenced by Lévi-Strauss and structural anthropology and structural geography and urban geography in this work. It was this idea of bringing the structure of a city into a kind of understanding which will then develop a typology for the present out of the historical fabric of the past that inspired me to write the third typology. Typological form refers then, said Rossi, to a form which either is a result of its being chosen during certain periods, or the implication ascribed to it has ended up by assuming the synthetic character of a process which exactly shows the form itself. Architectural innovations always reveal particular tendencies, but they do not constitute typological invention. If we realize that typology is shaped only by a long process of time and possesses highly complex links with the city and society. They're a very strong link to German Romanticism, to Hegelian historicism, and to modernist abstraction at the end, culminating in the notion that Rossi has of a typology that is innate to a city and can be reconstructed inventively by an architect who then will not destroy the city fabric as she or he inserts that typology into the city. And here, some of the objects of Rossi's first enthusiasm for Enlightenment typologies, and the object that inspired me to write this notion of the city as generating, very much inspired myself by Maurice Alvac, the urban geographer of France in the 1920s and 30s, around the question of memory, history, and the city as having a kind of innate memory. And as someone who, at this moment in my life, was extremely attracted to the work of Guy Debord and the Situationists, I had this sense of the psychology of the sense of a memory, which is also a psychology of a city habitat, out of which could be constructed a city that would reflect contemporary and historical values, as opposed to the erasure of the traditional city proposed by the modernists under the Charter of Athens, and particularly espoused by Corbusier's understanding in The Radiant City. At this moment, in the late 60s and early 70s, there emerges a counter-voice. A counter-voice which, to a certain extent, is directed to undermine the notion of consistent and optimistic typological forms in relationship to autonomous disciplines. And it is, of course, the voice of Michel Foucault, who, in a series of works that gradually became translated and known in the Anglo-Saxon and Italian and Spanish world, History and Madness, The History of Madness, The Birth of the Clinic, and Words and Things, develops a powerful critique of institutional forms as ideologically framed, and here he's obviously referring to a contemporary of his, Louis Althusser, who had established the theory of ideological disciplines, ideological narratives, and ideological state apparatuses. And here, in his first great lecture at the Collège de France, The Order of Discourse, Foucault demonstrates that discourse has, in fact, only disorder and only dissemination and no central fabric except that which is named ideologically and framed for the certain purposes of power. And so the discourse of the hospital is a discourse which is totally enclosed within the walls of something which is supposed to medically treat you, but in fact is a discourse which moves into society itself and all the legal and bourgeois structures that allow for certain disciplines like medicine, certain disciplines like psychiatry, to operate as other disciplines do not, for the curing of bodies and souls. And it is, of course, in the very celebrated 1974-75 Survey Punir, where Foucault sees a kind of panoptical principle operating throughout the 19th and 20th century in relationship to incarceration, yes, but also in relationship to something that he develops in his later discursive theories of power, that power which innately one takes on personally and subjectively in order to, in fact, control the self in terms of the wishes of the power collective. And it is, of course, not to be forgotten that Survey Punir came very strongly out of Foucault's actual activity as a political instigator of resistance against the terrible conditions that existed in Parisian prisons at the time. Of course, this was the moment when thousands of Algerian citizens of France and Algerian combatants in North Africa were being incarcerated in the most terrifying conditions, and where we have here outside the prisons, because you weren't allowed to go inside French prisons at that epoch, you have Jean-Paul Sartre on the left and Foucault with a megaphone on the right, proclaiming the right for prisoners to claim a reform. And the first time he actually went inside a prison was when he was teaching at SUNY Buffalo in the 70s, when he went into Attica prison just after the terrible slaughter that the state had organized in Attica under the governorship of Rockefeller in order to break the prison strike in Attica of 1970-71. What interested Foucault about Attica was that the front of Attica as a prison, architecturally, was a castle, a kind of medieval castle, really a kind of symbol of defending society against the criminals and giving the criminals a sense of doom as they entered. But behind that was a machine, as Foucault called it, a machine of iron, of steel and glass, of cages, where the prisoners were encased, like, as he said, animals in a zoo. It is at this moment that Foucault realizes that it's not a simple, unified and constructed and, if you like, typological sense of panopticism, but a dispersed sense of panopticism which has developed different, if you like, baby panopticons across the institutional framework of bourgeois society, which he begins to characterize as heterotopology, the topology of heterogeneity. Heterotopology, not heterology, not heterotopia, but heterotopology. And it's interesting that his first attempt at explaining what he will later call heterotopia, is in a radio talk given to children about dreaming. I give you an example. There are, to be sure, placeless realms without place, utopias. Histories without chronology. Cities, planets, universes of which it would be impossible to find a trace, neither on any map nor in any heaven, simply because they did not belong to any space. Without doubt, these cities, these continents, these planets were born, as they say, inside the heads of humans, or strictly speaking, in the interstices of their words, the thickness of their stories, or again, in the placeless place of their dreams, in the void of their hearts. In brief, this is the sweetness of utopias. Nevertheless, I think that there are, in every society, utopias that have a precise and real place, a place that one could situate on a map, utopias that have a determined time, a time that one could fix and measure according to the calendar of all the days. It's even probable that each human group, whatever it cuts out in the space that it occupies or really lives or works, cuts out utopic spaces. And in the time that are its busy, uchronic moments, this is what I wish to say. One does not live in a neutral white space. One does not live, die, or love in the rectangle of a sheet of paper. Architects have note. One lives, dies, and dies in a space that is gridded, cut up, variegated, with light and dark zones, differences in levels, stairs, holes, bumps, hard and fragile regions, penetrable, porous. These are the regions of passage, streets, trains, subways. These are the regions open to momentary pause, cafes, cinemas, benches, hotels. And then there are the closed regions of rest and being at home. Yet among these places that are distinguished from each other, there are those that are absolutely different. Places that are opposed to all the others, that are destined in some way to efface them, neutralize them, purify them. These are in some way counter spaces. I dream of a science that would have for its object these different spaces, these other places, these mythical and real contestations of the space in which we live. This science would study past utopias, since it must reserve its name for that which truly has no place, but heterotopias, those absolutely other spaces necessarily the science in question will be called, it is already called, heterotopia. So this is where, for the first time, Foucault brings this notion of heterotopia into theoretical discourse, and we have to understand that it's brought as a contesting discourse to utopia, to positive thought, to prospective thought, to architectural thought in general. Heterotopias are, in fact, those realms which control, those realms which confine, those realms which are opposed to the apparently free and liberal order, but which give that liberal order its potent relationships. And yet, heterotopia is picked up as a word and as a theory and as an understanding out of those who have, like Oswald Matthias Ungers, in the 60s and mid-60s, begun to question the idea of singularity in relationship to typology and embraced the idea of multiplicity in relationship to typology, and will, under the inspiration of a young assistant in Cornell, Rem Koolhaas, Ungers will embrace the notion of heterotopia as a planning strategy, a strategy which has been used in various ways through the ensuing decades, as a planning strategy, if you like, for filling the holes with a kind of proto-utopic environment, the city of Berlin as reconstructed, West Berlin as reconstructed under IBA or IBA, and Berlin's Green Archipelago constructed here in drawings by Ungers and Rem Koolhaas in the early 1970s. These notions, utopia, heterotopia, and typology, have recently been, I think, in a very fertile sense, revived by a very strong advocate of autonomy, Pier Vittorio Aureli in Italy, in the Netherlands, and in London, and more recently in Yale. Pier Vittorio has, in this first little work, the project of autonomy, linked in a very fertile way, I think, almost in a sense replaying Kaufmann, Kant, and the ethical, political vision of an architecture of autonomy, has linked the project of autonomy to a project of autonomy which actually emerged in parallel to and in the same moment as the Rossian, Eimaninian autonomy of architecture in the 60s and 70s in Italy. The Autonomia movement, which was, of course, one of the great leftist worker movements of Italy in the 70s, the worker movement of resistance. And it is out of these works and out of, if you like, reviewing the historical trajectory of my own understanding and perception of the notion of autonomy that I will tentatively produce for you. You heard it first here, a fourth typology. At the moment, it's not existing. It is hypothetical, and I think over the next 3 days, you will be debating various aspects of it: political, social, formal, architectural, professional, disciplinary, what have you. But I will read it for you, and you can do with it what you will. In this world of heteronymous worlds, a single typology is bound to fail. Utopia and heterotopia are concepts of resistance working in retreat through isolation and withdrawal. Islands are also gated communities. Architecture has never been autonomous and can never be. Architecture is not autonomous. Architects are not autonomous. Architects are multiple, from the community of workers to technological experts. Architecture is immersed in the global struggle for human rights: the right to occupancy, the right to the city, the right to environment. A fourth typology recognizes these rights and translates them into spatial practice that is both ecological and social. A fourth typology is the architecture of rights. It uses the politics of architectural space to fight the politics of social space. The fourth typology has not yet been invented. Thank you. You can ask me anything, okay? It doesn't even have to be about that, as long as it's not too personal. Yes?
I would like to, just on the side, I'd like to know if you read, how do you think that Foucault actually turned this thinking on type to something different? How did Foucault distorted fundamentally these thought that typology was an instrumental mechanism that was...
Well, I think it's very clear in his treatment of the panopticon. The panopticon is an architectural project for a prison or a workhouse or a school or whatever Bentham wants that little tower of order to construct. It's a literal invention, as Bentham says, to reform and to construct and reconstruct mentally the minds of the individual, that isolates the individual in each of the segments of the circle and puts the individual under surveillance in the center. That becomes an architectural type, which is actually used in prisons across the world, in Philadelphia, in Paris, and elsewhere in terms of the organization of control. What Foucault does in Surveiller et Punir is to dismember that type and make it clearly an object which is simply a part of a very, very broad and discursive legal, social, ethical, and bourgeois strategy of control. In other words, the type is fundamentally dismembered into what Foucault calls discourse. This is why I think at the moment of, if you like, you mentioned this moment of heightened postmodern historicism where to a certain extent theory had become abstracted from architectural practice. To a certain extent, the theory that emerges after and with Foucault, the way in which architects pick up on Deleuze, the way in which architects pick up on Derrida, this is a theory against theory. This is a theory which wants to deconstruct traditional theory. This is a theory which wants to, in fact, open up and reveal the latent power structures in traditional bourgeois academic and architectural theory. So, to a certain extent, the theory after these great moments in French theory of the 60s and 70s, the theory is in architecture is reduced to courses which teach students about how not to take theory of architecture seriously, right, and how to undermine the whole role of architecture in society. So, to a certain extent, on the one hand, I am deeply, and was at the moment, deeply affected by Foucault's play between resistance and action, and think all architects should be both activists in society, because they are, after all, citizens, and at the same time are proposing structures in society, but that to a certain extent, Foucault makes us think about the different impositions, the different power struggles, the different, makes us really acutely aware of the instruments that we deploy. And there I think that awareness does in fact destabilize the utopic notion of typology, and shows us that the utopic notion of typology is in fact a heterotopic institution of power throughout society, which allows us to, I think, gauge our own interventions much more precisely. So, for example, if we are interested in the environment, I think it's important for us as architects to have in our minds that every intervention, every structure, every instrument that we fabricate and place into society ought, in a kind of zero-sum game, not to contribute to the degradation of the environment in any way. Now, that's, of course, impossible, but if we have in mind the zero sum of environmental impact, we can at least proportion our and understand the impact of that which we employ. So, yes, I think there was a certain a kind of unwrapping. I didn't talk about Derrida this afternoon because it's a much more complex argument, but there is a certain way in which Derrida speaks about architecture, which I think is incredibly fruitful, which is, again, to remove the typology from the debate. In fact, to talk about, Derrida has this wonderful interview in the 80s where he talks about how could we think about architecture before architecture exists, before the word exists and before the system exists, before Vitruvius exists. And, he has this statement which resonates, I think, with Foucault, who repeats it later in an interview. We have to rewrite the book of architecture. I don't think anybody's done it yet, not even Patrick Schumacher. Yes?
Thank you for being here, Mr. Vidler. I am wondering, I'm completely happy to read about the right to occupancy, the right to the city, the right to the environment. And but what I'm wondering is why we have to call for typology. Why we have to?
I don't call for typology.
Or why it should to be to call the number? What I'm wondering is why we need to say it's first, second, third, fourth.
Oh, that's a joke.
Yeah, I know. But the one.
I wrote a terrible article called The Third Typology, and this is an apology for that. called the fourth typology.
Yes, but
Okay?
what I'm wondering...
Don't take it, please don't take me seriously.
Yes, but
Take
you know...
nothing I say seriously.
Yes.
This
and
is
you know
just
what
theory.
Yeah. But for example, I'm a very good friend of Peter Cook, and the problem with the non-serious things, sometimes in the mind of the people, is
You're absolutely right.
Yes, because
the worst jokes in the world are told by Donald Trump.
Yes,
And he means them. Yeah. No, you're absolutely right. Why do I did it as a kind of rhetorical device, and to a certain extent, if you read through those propositions, typology disappears. Right? Typology disappears, and I think architecture can no longer rely on a typological, historical approach to itself or to the environment, but has to reinvent strategies. It has to reinvent materials. It has to reinvent economies. It has to reinvent clients, and it has to reinvent programs. And that, as far as I'm concerned, can be called something completely different than typology. You're absolutely right.
the last thing. What another word we could invent? Because it's the power of the.
Well,
word.
you suggest. Give me a word.
You remember, for example, you remember Garcia.
The fourth ...
You remember in Garcia Marquez when he was writing Macondo, and he said, "I'm pointing with the finger because I still don't know the name of the thing, but I know this going on."
Right.
So the thing is, how?
Well, that's wonderful.
I don't know how should be the word, but I'm scared about typology, but I don't know how we should name. It's like a kind of Macondo.
No, you're right. It's a very interesting problem. There's that wonderful picture by Raphael of Plato and Aristotle standing next to each other in the school of Athens, the school of Athene, where Plato's holding his book about cosmology, the Timaeus, and pointing like that, and Aristotle's holding his book of ethics and pointing like that, right? So I'll point like that to the future, right? And hope that we can invent something. If you think of a word, email me. No, I really respect that question. To name it, I think is absolutely correct. And I can't do anything about this now. I think I can't erase this. No. Oh, yeah, it's gone. Okay.
Thank you very much.
Yes.
Yes. Thank you, Professor, for your words. I enjoyed your lecture. I have to admit, I have a little bit of a struggle.
Good.
I have a little bit of a struggle, and I may need one more maybe sentence or explanation in what is your personal connection between typology and autonomy.
I'm not sure that... Okay, I better stand here. I'm not sure that there is a rational connection between autonomy and typology, but that's the connection that was made in the 60s and 70s by architects. So the way in which architectural autonomy was ensured in terms of not form, not structure, and not program, the three Vitruvian moments, the way in which it was thought we could bind those things together in a single word, which could give us the idea of a concrete whole that nevertheless has a relationship to all the concrete units of architecture which historically have made the city, was typology. So it was a word that emerged in theory in order to propose another kind of autonomous unity to architecture in the 70s and 80s.
Following on the joke, maybe it could be the next typology?
The what?
Instead of the fourth, could be the next.
The next, yeah, I mean, but I think we were objecting to the very idea of typology.
Yeah,
So
I know.
Yeah, so I'm not a theorist. I just think, and I'll think about this.
This was my joke. Sorry.
Yeah, no, it was a rhetorical. Yeah, whatever. Yeah. Yes.
when you discuss the heterotopia by Foucault, what do you think about the position of Tafuri, who used that concept to define in somehow the modern architecture, starting from Piranesi, I think, towards the 70s, and the utopia, and all of that discussion, I think, against autonomy and against Kaufman, and even probably against Rossi. How do you posit these theories in these kind of discussions?
Well, I think there are two things. One, Tafuri will use all the emerging concepts of philosophy and theory as they emerge, whether it's Derridian, Foucauldian, Lacanian, or whatever, in order to characterize the critical mode of the contemporary period. And he will use that as a way of understanding what he understood to be the last period of architecture. He was not for or against, well, he was probably more against than he was for, but, you know, there was something about, you know, he and I were always arguing, of course, but we always agreed that the one thing we did like, even though we hated it, was architecture, right? But there was a love of architecture somewhere there, because otherwise you don't write on it, you don't think about it, you don't occupy it, you don't talk to architects, right? So I think with Tafuri, there's an ambiguous moment where, of course, he was trained as an architect. He drew very well, and at the same time was convinced that architecture politically was so much deeply invested in the prevailing bourgeois order that it was politically untenable. So I think, yeah, I mean, but at the same time, he was very, I think, very brilliantly able to use the critical tools that philosophers like Foucault and Derrida gave him in order to unveil, unravel, and historicize the architectural project. Is that? Yeah. Yes. Is it lunchtime? Last question?
Last one? Well, first of all, thank you for the lecture. I think it's been really great. I'm happy to see you here after New York. And well, I think it's very interesting the way you show always the pictures, the portraits of the authors you mentioned. Also, you mentioned some things of their biographies and what is the context in which they live, which is very important. Then we forget to discuss about that in all these kind of questions, but I think it's very important. So now today that we are in this moment of global emergencies and everything, maybe our biographies are more in the line of over-information, overexposure and everything. So instead of needing people to unveil things for us or showing information we don't know or talking to us about how power structures control whatever, now we are like overwhelmed with information. So from your perspective as an educator for such a long time, what do you think is the most urgent thing to do in the academia in terms of it's more of awareness, we have to work on commitment, we have to work more on critical positions, or is more we maybe need a real historical review for all the students, or what do we need today from your experience? This is the last question, so you know.
Yeah. Well, one, no, I like to, you know, I remember my friends. So yes, there are pictures of people, because people are behind the thoughts. You use the word exposed. There's a recent work by Bernard Harcourt, who is an editor of some of the Foucault seminars, and recently published the French and English version of the Foucault seminar, one of the earlier ones on punishment. And this work is called Exposed. And it's called, and in a sense what he's doing is arguing about the transition from a panoptical society to a society which is exposed not simply because it is surveyed, but because it is also self-exposed. In other words, we expose ourselves quite willingly every time we open a phone, every time we move in the global arena. So it's a very interesting work. It does not necessarily come to any quote-unquote architectural conclusions. I think two things. One, as a kind of educator, teacher who is more interested in learning than didactically teaching, I wanted simply to present a few of the introductory themes that will, having read some of the papers over the next 2 days, will characterize this conference, right? So the words I've introduced will be debated, I hope, and obviously by many papers in the conference. So in that sense, I'm launching a conversation that has already been curated so well by Sylvia and her colleagues. So I think I just say to any friends or students or interlocutors that first you have to come to a conclusion about where you are as a subject in the society that you live. Are you for it? Are you against it? Are you with part of it? Are you with not part of it? Are you defensive? Are you offensive? Are you withdrawn? Are you nostalgic? Where are you as a subject, right? Your subject position defines your architectural position. At that moment, you can gradually work into questions of whether you are more interested in NGOs in Africa or in Asia or in climate science or in material science or in the construction of emergency housing. There are a whole range of projects that architecture needs to concern itself today, which are not, and I really do say not, the glamour projects of large-scale institutional branding projects that have been so rife in the last 10 to 15 years in Europe and America. That is not where architecture ought to be. I say that absolutely. Architecture should be a collective movement of those who wish rationally to work for the good of the population of the world. Where you want to do that and how you want to do that, whether you want to concentrate on the moment where an infant learns to walk and understand the scales of that achievement in order to build a creche, whether you want to construct a series of demountable and lightweight materials to be flown to disaster areas. Those questions are for you as a subject, a political, civic subject in society to decide for yourselves. I decided that I was, because of my passions, because of my interest, and because of my sense of my ability to ask questions and just to be with generations of students and colleagues, I decided to do what I do. I was once much more of a public activist than I am now. I probably should be more active in relationship to what I do, but the time I have is limited, and I've decided that writing and talking, at least I can get people to oppose me, right? And if people oppose me, they're starting to think. And if people start to think, then maybe architecture has a future. Thank you.